Alright guys, welcome back to period 6 of the APUSH curriculum. We are up to topic 6.7 titled Labor in the Gilded Age. Now, in case we have not discussed this already, I don't remember that we have, the term Gilded Age is a term that we use to describe basically the time period after the Civil War up until about 1900. And it's a term that's used sometimes negatively to describe this time period as a time where the rich got rich and the poor stayed poor. And the reason it's called the Gilded Age is to gild something is to basically put a very thin layer of gold or some other precious metal on top of something so that it appears to be solid gold when it's only just that thin layer at the top. And it's kind of a metaphor for this era where there was lots of wealth being created, but it was unevenly distributed throughout the population. Anyhow, we're going to focus on labor unions, and all that kind of good stuff in this particular topic. So let's jump into this and look at how industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898 is affecting workers. And we're going to look first at just some workforce changes. Now, the first note we're going to make is one that we are already familiar with because it's a trend we've been following throughout American history, and that is the number of workers in industry versus farming is beginning to shift, right? We have more and more workers in industry and fewer in farming. We're also seeing a growth of child labor as well, and we're going to get into that topic here in a moment. But look at the trend, right? Percentage of U.S. workforce engaged in farm labor. Notice how we're going from about almost 70% in 1840 down to less than 40% in 1900. So that's a dramatic drop, and of course it's going to continue to drop after that point. Same thing we see here. 50% or so of people were engaged in one form or the other with agriculture in 1870, and by 1910, less than a third of Americans were engaged in agriculture. This one shows us the growth of child labor. So 1870 we're going to begin with, and you'll see we've got about 765,000 workers between ages 10 and 15. Okay, in thousands of workers it tells us. And then that number is going to increase to the point where we get to 1900. We are talking over 4 million workers who are teenagers. Okay. I mean, that's a big number. And we're not talking about, the kid bagging groceries at Publix. We're talking about kids working in factories, working in mines, working on railroads, jobs that can be pretty dangerous, pretty dirty, pretty hard on kids, especially as they're developing. They should be in school, of course, but instead they're working in a factory. Now, as the price of goods begin to decrease because of mass production, we're going to see an interesting trend in that wages from workers are actually going up. So, yes, the Gilded Age is an unequal distribution of wealth. There's no doubt about that. But, to suggest that people just continue to be poor forever is not true either. In general, workers' wages were going up. Between 1870 and 1890, you can see we're talking over 150% increase. I mean, that's a pretty big deal, right? Now, you're also going to see an increased access to a variety of goods and services. So again, with mass production and competition comes better quality products at a better price. And so, Americans, their standard of living is going up. Okay. And when I say standard of living, I mean things like access to education, access to health care, food, homes, just all the things you need to survive. If you're meeting those needs, your standard of living goes up. But as we said earlier, there's a large gap between rich and poor in the Gilded Age. But, that's no different than any other time in American history because we have capitalism. And in capitalism, economic equality anyways, is not one of the goals. The goal is to give people the freedom to make their own economic decisions. All right, so look at the distribution of wealth in the Gilded Age. So you can see the percentage of population in the top 1%. So obviously only 1% of the people can be in the top 1%, but look how much money they control. So 1% of the people control over 50% of all the wealth. whereas the bottom 40% control just this tiny little sliver here. All right, let's talk about labor unions now. And to understand the relationship between worker and employer, let's first look at something called technological unemployment. And technological unemployment means finding basically machines to do the work of humans, so that people lose their jobs because they're being replaced by machines. And as an employer, if you're trying to improve your profit, you're going to be doing that, right? You're constantly looking for cheaper and cheaper labor. And of course, a machine is the cheapest of all, because a machine doesn't need to take a break. A machine doesn't need to have health care. A machine doesn't complain. It doesn't ask for a raise. It doesn't ask for anything. It just keeps going and makes you profit. Now, the employer, besides also looking for those machines to replace their workers, they always have some leverage over the workers, in that they can always, if your workers are getting a little restless and demanding higher wages or shorter hours or something, what you can do is you can just ship in mass amounts of unemployed workers via rail to kind of pad out your factory. And it's a reminder to your workers that, hey, if you don't like your job here, go somewhere else. I'll find 10 other people who want your job right now. So let's look at this cartoon. Is this cartoon depicting a businessman as robber barons or captains of industry? And the answer is pretty clear. Robber barons, right? Notice how he's shaking the wealth out of this guy. And it says there profits from child labor and all that stuff. All right, let's look at some other tools that corporations had to weaken their workers. They could put pressure on judges to issue these things called injunctions. An injunction is basically a ruling that says legally you can't strike. Okay, so end your strike. The strike is illegal. If you continue to do it, you're breaking the law. Now, to put down said strike, again, corporations, because they have a lot of money, they could put pressure on, say, the governor of a state or some federal politician, maybe even the president, to call out the troops to put down the strike or to move the workers out. A corporation could also do what's called a lockout, which is almost like a reverse strike, in the sense that you refuse to let your workers come to work until they agree to terms you like. And if you have enough money saved up, you could do this to starve them basically into coming back to work on your terms. You could require an oath as a condition of employment, and this oath would say, I will not join a union. You could also put people on a blacklist, and a blacklist, of course, is a way of distributing names of people who were seen as troublemakers by businessmen. So you would get this reputation of being a rabble-rouser, troublemaker, or whatever, and so you couldn't find a job because you're on a blacklist. All right, this is one of my favorite paintings from this era. It's called The Strike. And if you had me for world history, you've already seen this painting, so I showed it to you then too. But what I love about this painting is it really shows you that tension between the working class and the industrial class, the haves and the have-nots and all that kind of stuff. And you can tell it's a tense situation because not just the body language, but this guy right here, right? He's about to pick up a rock, and we know that this strike is about to turn violent. Now, let's talk about unions specifically now. So think about modern-day America. Can you name any unions? And my guess is you probably can't, because labor unions, particularly in the private sector, outside of things like the auto industry, they're just not common at all any longer. But there were a few back in this time period that made a pretty big impact on American history. So the first one we're going to look at today is called the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor got started shortly after the Civil War. For the time period, it was a remarkably inclusive labor union. Basically, whether you're a skilled or unskilled worker, you could have a job, or you could have a place rather, in this labor union. Male, woman, black, white, it didn't matter. Anyone could join the Knights of Labor. It was seen as kind of like that one big labor union that could get workers across America better deals. Now, let's think about what the Knights of Labor would demand. And the Knights of Labor, of course, are going to demand the things you would expect out of a labor union. Shorter working hours, they called the 8-hour day. They wanted to see workers own the factories. In other words, when the factories make money, that money would be then distributed to the workers, not just the owners. They wanted to see child and prison labor abolished because, kids and, of course, prisoners, they're not getting paid much of anything. And so this is hard to compete with if you're an adult worker who's trying to earn a wage to support a family. They were pushing for equal pay for men and women, which was remarkably progressive for the era. And they also wanted safer working conditions. So they have a lot of demands that they're making of employers. The leader of the Knights of Labor was Terence V. Powderly, well-known labor leader. And he was a very successful organizer, and he's a guy who's going to win several important strikes for the 8-hour day. And what happens with these type of reforms is, once you get the reform passed in different businesses, it becomes kind of the thing that other businesses have to go along with. So if you can convince enough business to go for the 8-hour day, then pretty much all businesses will have to follow suit. Now, before we move on, I want to say something about Terence Powderly, and it happens to be his unbelievable mustache. I mean, check that thing out. Look at that. You may not realize this, but big mustaches were pretty popular in the late 1800s, so much so that they used to make mustache cups. Okay, I kid you not, this was a real thing. There's the place where your mustache goes so it doesn't get in your coffee or tea or whatever you're drinking. Weird. All right, now, to understand what happens in the Knights of Labor, we need to look at a very famous incident that takes place in Chicago in May of 1886. It's called the Haymarket Square Affair. It's also known as the Haymarket Riot. And first of all, we need to get a little bit of background on Chicago. So Chicago in the late 1800s was the second biggest city in America. It was a booming industrial town with factories and stockyards and slaughterhouses and meat packing plants. Lots of immigrants were moving there. It's just this teeming mass of people. It was also a very tense city as well. And the police had a reputation of being rather brutal to workers and immigrants. And so a meeting was called to protest brutality against the police. It was going to take place in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And what happens is during this demonstration, the police arrive to just, kind of diffuse the situation and to call an end to the protest. And somebody, and we'll never probably know who, throws a dynamite bomb at the police. And 7 police officers are killed. Many more police and bystanders are wounded. There's also a hail of gunfire between the two sides. It just turns into an absolute chaotic mess. Now, this turns out to be a big blow to the Knights of Labor, and the reason was, even though they didn't organize this, and even though the assassins of those police officers were not Knights of Labor members, they have guilt by association. And what I mean by that is, a lot of people saw it as very easy to lump labor unions and these crazy anarchists together as one group. And so if you were a member of a labor union, you were seen as, basically one step away from a terrorist by some people. And this is going to lead to a lot of people leaving the Knights of Labor. Another key weakness of the Knights of Labor is the fact that because they offered membership to both skilled and unskilled workers, when unskilled workers went on strike, well, it was hard for skilled workers to stand up for them because a skilled worker has a lot of leverage with his employer because he has that skill, whereas an unskilled labor can be easily replaced. And so there's a lot of tension between those skilled and unskilled workers in the Knights of Labor. All right, let's look at our second and final labor union from this era. We're going to call it the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, which, by the way, is still around. Today it's called the AFL-CIO, AFL-CIO. All right, anyways, this is set up in 1886 by a guy named Samuel Gompers. Gotta love that name. There he is. Now, he envisioned a different type of labor union. Rather than having like one massive union for all industries, he thought the better thing to do is have like a confederation of labor unions. So you would have individual little self-governing labor unions that have one big umbrella, the AFL. It's almost kind of like how the states and the federal government interact. There's like little individual states, and there's, of course, one federal government over them all. That's kind of how the AFL is going to work. Also, instead of focusing on all workers, he's going to focus, Gompers is, on skilled workers. These are people, again, that if they go on strike, they have a lot of leverage against their employer because you can't just easily replace skilled workers. They don't, they're not just hanging around in the street corner waiting for work. And through this strategy, Gompers is able to gain better wages, better hours, and better working conditions for his members. He's also fighting against this thing called the he's fighting for this thing called the closed shop. And the closed shop is this idea that if you want to have a job in this particular business, as a condition of your employment, you have to join the union. There's no choice in that. The opposite of this is the open shop, where you can be part of a union or not be part of a union. It's totally up to you. And by having closed shops, this, of course, gives labor unions way more leverage, way more power, and way more members. Gompers also was good at organizing and raising money, and so if they were going to go out on strike, they would do this strategically. They would have what's known as a war chest built up. That way, when workers aren't earning a salary, the labor union is meeting their needs until the strike has been won. All right, guys, that's it for labor unions from 1865 to 1898. And in our next video, we'll continue looking at period 6.